Look at a map of the world, any map, the one in your head right now. It's wrong. Not the borders, not the politics, the land itself. There is a continent missing from it, a real one, rock and crust and the whole thing. And it has been missing for as long as human beings have drawn maps. In 2017, a team of 11 geologists published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal called GSA Today. The title was flat and certain: Zealandia, Earth's hidden continent. No question mark, no maybe. Under the Pacific Ocean, they said, there is a continent larger than India, and it has been sitting there for 23 million years. We sailed over it, we fished on top of it, we mapped its mountains one island at a time, and never once understood what we were standing on. I remember reading that paper. I read the abstract 3 times, slowly. Because how exactly do you lose a continent? Start with a question that sounds stupid. What is a continent, really? Most people would say it's big, and it's land, and you live on one. Fair. But geologists don't define it that way. And the gap between those two definitions is the entire story. A continent is not about size. It is not about being dry. It comes down to 4 things, and only 4. 1. It has to stand high above the ocean floor around it. 2. It has to be built from the full family of continental rock, not just the dark volcanic basalt that paves the deep sea. 3. Its crust has to be thicker than oceanic crust and put together differently. 4. It has to be a single, well-defined block, big enough to count, not a scatter of unrelated crumbs. Zealandia passes all 4, every one of them. And here's what's strange. Madagascar doesn't. Greenland doesn't get to be its own continent either. Geologically, it's just a corner of North America. We assume the biggest islands are continents in waiting. They aren't. The thing that actually qualifies is the one you can barely see. The team behind that 2017 paper, led by a New Zealand geologist named Nick Mortimer, made a simple argument. The only reason nobody had called Zealandia a continent before was an accident of where it sits. 94% of it is underwater, out of sight, and so far out of mind that it took until the 21st century for anyone to bother adding up the pieces. Sit with that 94% for a second, because it's the whole problem. If you could drain the Pacific, just peel the water off like a bedsheet, Zealandia would be impossible to miss. A long spine of continent running from north of New Caledonia all the way down past New Zealand into the cold sub-Antarctic, an area roughly 2/3 the size of Australia. You wouldn't argue about it. You'd just look at it and know. But we can't drain an ocean, so for 200 years we saw only the bits that break the surface. New Zealand, New Caledonia, the Chatham Islands, Lord Howe. To every mapmaker who ever charted them, these were islands, separate dots, unrelated leftovers of old volcanoes thrown across an empty sea. Nobody drew the line that joined them, because the line ran a kilometer underwater. And this is the part that gets under my skin a little. We had the data for decades. We just didn't read it correctly. Through the Cold War, navies on both sides mapped the seafloor obsessively. A submarine needs to know the terrain it hides in. Sonar readings piled up by the ton. Much of it stayed classified, then leaked out slowly through the 1990s. And buried inside those depth charts was the outline of a continent, drawn in soundings, just waiting. We had been staring straight at Zealandia for years. We simply didn't know that's what we were staring at. And people had been circling the answer for more than a century. Back in 1895, a Scottish-born naturalist named James Hector looked at New Zealand and guessed it was the worn-down stump of a much larger land that had gone under the sea. The name Zealandia itself was coined a full 100 years later, in 1995, by an American geophysicist named Bruce Lyondike, who could already see the shape sprawling across the maps. The pieces were all on the table. It just took another 22 years and a stack of drill cores before anyone laid them side by side and used the word continent without flinching. So how do you prove a continent exists when you can't stand on it? You read the rock through a kilometer of seawater. 3 tools did the work. First, gravity. A satellite can feel it. A continent carries more mass than the thin oceanic crust around it, and that extra mass tugs, very slightly, on anything passing overhead. Map that pull from orbit, and the hidden block of Zealandia lights up like a bruise under the skin. Second, sonar. Multi-beam arrays that sweep the bottom and build the 3-dimensional shape of mountains and plateaus no human eye will ever see directly. And third, the one that ends the argument, drilling. You send out a ship, the JOIDES Resolution, a drilling vessel with derrick taller than the deck is long. You punch a hole into the seabed and you haul up a core, a cylinder of the actual rock. When geologists pulled Zealandia's cores, going back through the old DSDP and ODP drilling programs, and then a dedicated expedition of its own, they did not find basalt, the heavy dark stone of the ocean floor. They found granite, gneiss, sandstone, continental rock, the same family of stone that builds the mountains you can climb with your own hands. That is proof you can hold. The crust under that stretch of Pacific runs 10 to 30 kilometers thick. Too thick to be ocean floor, which is barely 7. Thinner than a full-grown continent, sure, but built like one. In 2017, a drilling ship ran the first expedition aimed squarely at this single question. 6 sites, 58 days at sea. More than 2,500 meters of core hauled up out of the seabed and laid open on deck. The cross-section everyone had argued about. Thin ocean crust on one side, thick Zealandian crust on the other, stopped being a diagram on a screen. It became something the crew could spread across a table and run their fingers along. Fine, the continent is real. Now the harder question: why is it underwater? For that, you go back about 80 million years to when Zealandia was still part of a single colossal landmass called Gondwana, the supercontinent that also held Australia, Antarctica, South America, Africa, India. Around 80 million years ago, Zealandia tore loose from it and started drifting off on its own. But tearing loose did something to the crust. It stretched it. Picture pulling a piece of warm clay. The middle thins out. That's what rifting did to Zealandia. It stretched the continental crust until it went thin. One of the geologists on the Discovery team put it better than I can. The crust stretched like pizza dough, pulled from the 30-plus kilometers of a normal continent down to barely 20, in some places even less. And there's a hard physical rule for what happens next. It's called Isostasy, and you already understand it without the word for it. Thick, light crust floats high, like an iceberg riding with most of its bulk above the water. Thin that crust, and it rides lower and lower, until the sea simply rolls in over the top. So Zealandia sank, not in a day, not in some single catastrophe. Over tens of millions of years, it just settled quietly, the shoreline creeping inland century after century, the way a tide comes in, if a tide took 10 million years to turn. Separation around 80 million years ago, the slow drowning starting maybe 50 million years back. And by 23 to 25 million years ago, most of the continent was gone under the water. 23 million years. That sounds ancient, and on a human scale, it is. Geologically, it's almost yesterday. I want to be straight with you about one thing here. Exactly how much of Zealandia was ever dry land at its highest is still argued over. Those are model estimates, not direct measurements. Some geologists think broad stretches of it stood above the waves. Others think a lot of it was always shallow sea. The disagreement is real, and I'd rather hand it to you honestly than pretend the picture is finished. What nobody disputes is the direction, down, for 20 million years, down. Which leaves something that genuinely haunts me. Before it drowned, what lived there? This is where the cores stop being geology and start being a time machine. When that same drilling expedition pulled sediment from a kilometer down, the layers held pollen, spores, the microscopic dust of plants, subtropical plants, ferns, the signature of a warm, green, living land, now lying in cold, black water a kilometer deep. More than 8,000 biological specimens came up out of those cores. 8,000. A whole drowned ecosystem read back out of a tube of mud. Go back 60, 80 million years, and Zealandia was not a drowned ruin. It was forest. Warm, dense, strange. There were dinosaurs walking on it. Fragments of them have been dug out of New Zealand, the meat-eating theropods and the long-necked sauropods, the first of them found by an amateur fossil hunter named Joan Whiffen, who flatly refused to believe the textbooks that said New Zealand had none. And a fingerprint of that lost world is still walking around today. New Zealand has almost no native land mammals, none of the four-legged kind. Before people arrived and brought them, the islands ran entirely on birds filling every job a mammal usually does. A parrot that hunts on the ground. A bird taller than a man. Why? Because Zealandia broke away from Gondwana early, before mammals spread across the rest of the world. The continent left the party before that particular guest ever showed up. It carried an older, stranger world out to sea with it. Then most of it sank, and what survives up on the high ground is some of the oddest wildlife on Earth. A museum of a continent that is mostly gone. And here's what people get wrong about Zealandia. They picture a corpse, a dead slab of old rock lying still on the bottom. It is not still. The boundary between two of the planet's great tectonic plates, the Pacific and the Australian, runs directly through it, straight through the continent. Along the South Island, it even has a name, the Alpine Fault, grinding sideways at nearly 40 millimeters a year, which is fast for anything that size. That is not a small detail. It is why New Zealand shakes the way it does, why it's one of the most earthquake-prone places people actually live, why that ground has killed. The same forces that drowned Zealandia are still grinding away at it right now. In some places, it is still sinking. In others, it's being shoved upward. The Southern Alps of New Zealand are rising something like 10 millimeters a year, which sounds like nothing, until you remember the mountains keep doing it, every year. Over the last 12 million years, that one fault has lifted the Alps by something like 20 kilometers of total rock. You just never see the full height, because erosion tears them down almost as fast as they climb. A piece of a sunken continent being shoved back toward the sky, one earthquake at a time. So this is no fossil. It's a slow, grinding, living machine, most of it hidden, the visible parts trembling now and then, just to remind everyone it's still there. We don't live beside Zealandia. New Zealanders live on the highest peaks of it, on the small, dry summit of something enormous and mostly underwater. And that is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If we could miss this, an entire continent, what else is down there? Zealandia, it turns out, is not a one-off. Under the Indian Ocean, beneath the island of Mauritius, geologists found grains of a mineral called zircon as old as 3 billion years, far older than the young volcanic island they were sitting inside. There was only one explanation: a fragment of ancient continent buried and forgotten under the lava. They named it Mauritia, published also in 2017 in the journal Nature Communications. Another lost piece. And there are more candidates out there, microcontinents, slivers of drowned land scattered across the seabed and still unclassified. Why do they keep slipping past us? Because we have barely looked. As of just a couple of years ago, Only about a quarter of the entire ocean floor had been mapped at a resolution good enough to do real geology on. A quarter. We have sharper maps of the surface of Mars than we do of most of our own seabed. If that gap, the sheer scale of what we still haven't looked at, grabs you the way it grabs me, then subscribing is the honest next step. This channel exists to go down into that next layer, the things hiding just under the obvious. Stay for those, because Zealandia was never really hidden. It was only unmapped. Now go back to that paper, 2017, GSA Today, 11 authors, years of survey lines, drill cores, gravity maps, all of it folded down into one quiet sentence in the abstract. That Zealandia is a continent, drowned but whole, not a discovery shouted from a mountaintop, just a fact that had been sitting in the data for decades, waiting for somebody to finally add it up and say it out loud. And here's what stays with me. It isn't the size of Zealandia, it isn't the dinosaurs, or even the drowning. It's the map. The one in your head. You grew up believing it was finished, that the continents were counted, that the big question of where had been settled centuries ago. It wasn't. The map was never finished. It was a draft. We just hadn't noticed yet. 7 continents, they taught us. There are 8.